We good?
Okay, Tom, you're live. You can go.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's been a few hours since we saw each other last. Hope everyone got some rest, if that was possible. We're on to another big meaty topic today. The quality management standards, specifically ISQM 1 and IS 220. Let's just stay back for a second and remind people what we're trying to accomplish in these sessions this week on these standards. One, I think, we were normally planning on approving the standards at this meeting. Instead, it's just inserted an extra opportunity, and with the goal, as if this is an elongated approval week going to September. And really what we're trying to get done this week is close off all substantive issues on the QM suite of standards. And that's really important. So we really make the run up into September about drafting, coordinating, refining. So September, while we're in a virtual setting, is not so hectic in terms of draft refinement. So I think that is really important. I think, one, we need to know if there are fatal flaws now and recognize a lot of these issues have been discussed on multiple occasions, and we've asked the task forces to come up with ideas on how to solve it. At some point we could keep on coming back to them, and you'll start seeing the ideas that existed a couple of years ago, because there's only so many solutions to the problem. So obviously we want to tackle everything, get things done, and close issues off so we could focus on the drafting and coordination. And just to remember that, again, this is an elongation of the approval process. Just if you were worried that we wouldn't have adequate time between now and September to approve, at the September meeting, we have 12 hours on the agenda dedicated to these standards as well, to get the drafting correct. And obviously the task force will be sharing what as appropriate, what are the expectations in terms of board feedback between now and September. So with that, I turn it over to Julie. I just want to compliment all three task forces for their continued work. While this hasn't been an approval meeting, I don't think the pace of work of the task forces has slowed down at all. They've acted as if it were the approval meeting, and that's precisely because we're trying to close out all of the key issues. So Julie, with that, I turn to you.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. And took the words out of my mouth there. I guess first want to just thank the awesome task force for ISQM 1, because we certainly have not taken our foot off the gas the last little while. We've sort of kept up with our meeting cadence as we would have if we were leading up to a June approval. So done a lot of work. You should have seen that reflected in the materials that we sent out. And it is an important meeting for us to get some board feedback, certainly on these substantive areas, because when we flip to the next slide, and as you saw in the issues paper, you'll see that these were the ones that we've talked again and again about. And I should probably just say that I don't have a joke for you this evening. I thought about what theme the joke might be in. Like, we've run around in circles a little bit at the task force, that could be a theme, or we're close to the finish line, that could be a theme. It was way too difficult to find a joke that fit all these scenarios. So Fiona, I'm sorry. I didn't live up to your standards on the joke, but I did try to find one. But with that, we're just going to jump right in to the session. I mentioned the topics that we're going to cover. These were all laid out in the issues paper in the order in which the issues paper was laid out. I'm going to take the issues paper as read. So as we work through each one of these topics, because we have a number of them to get through in this time slot, I think it would be a good use of our time to have the discussion as opposed to a recap, because I'm assuming you've read it and you've already contemplated your thoughts on the various issues. You'll see in a bit of an unusual twist, I am going to hand this over to Lynn at some point in the discussion to talk about 220. So there is an item that crosses over the two task forces. So she's going to pop in and talk about that. And then hopefully time permitting, we'll come back to the last topic under ISQM 1, which is external communications. So with that, I'm just going to jump right into the first topic. This picture should look familiar to all of you because this was a picture that we had originally introduced back in March to try to explain, really it's tried to explain the flow of how the firm's risk assessment process works, how we intended the paragraphs starting in paragraph 22 to work. We've simplified it based on the board feedback. And so we thought we would bring this back just to show you the clarifications we've made to it. It was in the issues paper, but really it's the steps, the first step being understanding the conditions, events, circumstances, actions, and inactions. So that's how you gather that information in order to determine your population of risks. Then you move on to your identification and assessment of the quality risk. So you're moving from a population of risks to quality risk. And in doing so, you consider that threshold being reasonable possibility. And then the outcome of that process is your quality risks at the end of the day, which have been identified and assessed. So just to clarify, that's the diagram we're working with. And we just brought it back to show you the simplification of it from the previous meeting. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. We had, as a task force, we've spent quite a bit of time on the firm's risk assessment process. And in doing so, we also looked at the definition of quality risk, because the definition of quality risk, as you'll remember back in the March papers, maybe was a little bit complicated by some extra words in there and maybe a duplication and some double negatives. And so the task force has worked on the simplification of that definition. And in doing so has also updated the paragraphs within the firm's risk assessment process to reflect the board feedback. So in particular, I mentioned the definition of the quality risk. So 19Q was updated and an application material paragraph added. And we also made some adjustments to paragraph 22C, which was really just splitting out the, we had one large requirement in 22C before, and we split that out between 22C and 22G. We've clarified and simplified 22E, which is really that paragraph that gets into the start of the risk assessment process and how you have that understanding, and then you move to the identification and assessment in the second step. And as I mentioned, 22G became a new paragraph, but really not new material because it was included in 22C before. The other change you would have seen in the drafting was some modifications made to the application material, most significantly modifications to reduce the number of examples we had in the application material, where we had tried to show a table of triggers or factors that might be considered in identifying a quality risk, and then what the outcome of the quality risk would be. So we slimmed that back to reflect the board comments on that to 2 or 3 examples there. So with that, Tom, I'm hoping to open up the discussion with both question 1 and 2 together, because they sort of flow together, and get the board's input on this topic.
Thank you, Julie. So we're seeking comments on question 1 about the revised definition of quality risk and the proposed suggestion changes to the firm's risk assessment process. And could I have any comments from the board? This is very unlike, oh, now we have them. I was a little worried there. Kaiue.
Yes, thanks, Tom, and good evening again from Germany. First, Julie, thanks for the presentation and the work you have done, and the opportunity we have got to discuss our aspects and our comments with you. Thank you very much for this. First, the first question, very brief. I agree with the revised definition and the related application material, even though I do not agree completely at a technical level with the arguments made for the change. And to the second question, referring to the firm's, yes, but I have some comments on this section in the draft standards. Does it make sense to talk about these comments now, or do we talk about it a little bit later? What do you think?
I think now.
Now,
It's the purpose of the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Let me start with I'm now in the agenda, the paper from the agenda item 5B. I have a comment to the firm's system of quality management before I come to my other comments. There, paragraph 13B. I'm not sure that I was a little bit joking that I always suspected that partners are not people, but this appears to confirm it. Sorry for this. On a more serious note, I'm not convinced that the proposed use of terms works. First, the term people and the context is rather colloquial. Second, as noted, partners are people. If you are seeking to use a term other than individuals to prevent singularity, I just says you use the term natural persons, which means the same.
Guy, I sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure we stay on. I think we're not quite to those paragraphs yet.
Okay.
We're 20. The requirements 22C to 22G.
Oh, sorry for it. I think I could included it, but sorry for this, Tom.
Okay.
Okay, then my comment. Yeah, okay. I think I can included it, but sorry for this. Okay, then my brief comment to requirement 22C. Here in application of 24F, the second sentence starts with the risk assessment process and so on. It is unclear to me how this works when there are separate objectives set for each component. That's one comment. And then I have one comment to paragraph A24G. In ISA 3000, revise the need to apply in literature approach is set forth in the requirement. Why not here? Is one comment. And then a third brief comment to paragraph A24H. This first sentence is written like a requirement, added may, so that it represents application material. So these are my comments to these requirements or application material to the firm's risk assessment process. Thanks.
Thank you. Fiona?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Julie, to yourself and the task force. I actually don't know how you've managed to do it remotely for everyone. It's challenging enough when you're trying to, at this stage of your project or a project, it's challenging enough to develop new ideas and be creative and do drafting when you're in the same room and you can hash it out and you can draw pictures and collaborate as a group. So how you've done it virtually, I will have no idea, but you should absolutely be commended for being able to get to where you've got to as a task force. So thank you very much. In terms of the first question, I'm very supportive of the definition of quality risk. And in terms of your second question around the changes to the firm's risk assessment process and the requirements and application material, again, supportive. Have some offline editorials that will provide you around the application material, but no concerns with the requirements. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Fiona. Josephine?
Evening, everybody. I want to just echo Fiona's word, Julie. Just amazing work. And thank you also for being so responsive to some of my questions over the period as well. I really appreciate that. With that, I am very supportive of what you've done here, both questions 1 or 2, and 2, in fact. And the only little minor thing I have is when your examples, which I really like in A24N. I know you're trying to get the balance right, but could we also have an example of the types of engagements? I think we had one in the December papers that drew on compilation engagements, but just so you've got one that connects to part 2 of that requirement. But thank you very much, very supportive.
Thank you. Roger?
Thanks, Julie, and echo the words on the congratulations to the task force. Very quickly, very supportive of both questions 1 and 2.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. Julie, very supportive of the revised definition and the addition in 22G. Only a couple of minor points really in the application material with A24F, and perhaps this was the same comment that Kai Ui made, I'm not sure, but in the box, the first bullet, the second sentence, we're just struggling with what that sentence meant in the smaller engagement where you've got the different components, how that works. Maybe that needs to be explained. And the other comment, we really liked the changes you made to A24N, simplifying down the examples, and the way they were explained was very helpful. Our only suggestion there is that would it be possible to have, for one of the examples in the left-hand column, to cover more than one component on the right-hand column. I think right now they're kind of one-to-one relationship. And if there was another component affected as well, that would probably help people understand how that might work. But other than that, looked really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Len?
Thank you, Tom. Julie, thank you very much, and congratulations to the staff and the task force for the work. On the definition, basically I'm fine with the definition, but perhaps thinking about a lot of people actually don't track our work. So maybe for a board, we understand the changes due to clarification, simplification. But when you take out the wording, likelihood, magnitude, and significance, people might be under the impression we are doing something we're not supposed to do. So I was wondering whether you can keep that concept, likelihood, magnitude, and significance in the application material. Because right now you take out from the definition and people are second guessing or overreacting. So I think that the definition is fine, but just that when people read the code without having the history, they might get lost why we are making a change. Second comment about paragraph 22E. I think that's a long requirement, and a lot of stuff in there are very, very useful. And I wonder whether we can keep that requirement simple at principle level. Some of the sub-bullets requirement, can that be moved to application material? Probably easier. Lastly, paragraph 22G, you talk about going through the process and adding new quality objectives. But if you read the code, it seems like you cannot take any objective out from your original list. So in that situation where the firms might change their business strategy, there might be other changes that some of the quality objectives may not be relevant anymore. So rather than just keep saying the requirements adding into quality objective, maybe using the word modify, altered into a requirement. So those are my 3 comments. Other than that, very supportive of the changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Isabel?
Yes, good evening, everybody. And again, great work from the task force. On question 1, I'm supportive of a revised definition of quality risk. However, when I read A11C, which is the application material to this definition, and more particularly the first sentence, we have the impression but you need first to determine if the risk will affect the achievement of a quality objective, and then as a second step to make another determination to see if the risk is a quality risk. While for me, it's exactly the definition. If it adversely affects the achievement of a quality objective, it is a quality risk. That's the definition. So why do we have an and in this first sentence of A11C? Maybe we should have IE, id est, or that is to say, whether the risk is a quality risk, because for the moment we have the feeling that we have two layers, while in fact the definition is more straightforward. And on question 2, I'm supportive of the changes to the firm's risk assessment process. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Kai Morton?
Thank you, and thank you to the task force for the changes that have been done to the document. Have some of the same concerns as Isabel just had on the application material A11C. Other than that, I'm supportive of question 1 and question 2.
Great. Fernando?
Hello, everyone. Julie, and to your team as well. Great work here. Very easy to read, and I think it follows a good structure to understand objectives, then the identification, assessment, and the responses. That's very helpful for people to understand how the risk assessment process flows. Very supportive as well on questions 1 and 2. We have only one minor suggestion to the requirement in 22G. Just to make it simpler and avoid some repetition between letters A, B, and C and the introduction of the requirement, but we can send that offline for your consideration. Thanks.
Thank you. Rich?
Great, thanks, Tom. You say that with I don't know, some anticipation or something, like Rich.
Because it only says on your name on top of it, just says Rich. So it's sort of like a football star with just a one name element.
Ronaldo, okay, yes. Thanks. So first, like others, thank to the task force and to Julie, and Julie arranged a separate call, which really helped, I think, both the task force, but also us in getting our points across. I have to say, I do like where we are at. I think a lot of our concerns have been addressed, and I do think we're getting ourselves closer to that position for September approval. On quality risk, again, like where the changes have gone, I would say we thought about internally about the definition of quality risk, and I started wondering that, well, maybe different people might read this differently. But having said that, I think that's okay because it's more principle based and therefore allows people to interpret what they need to for methodology. So I was okay where we got to. The one element on quality risk was the supporting application material in A11C, where we use the degree to which here. And I just wonder on documentation of this, will it come across as to what we need it to say, and will we be documenting all the conditions, events, and circumstances to achieve that, or as I hope it's not all, it's you're getting to what's relevant. But again, I think you can read that. The question is that clear enough? On the FRAP, again, like where we've got to, I think there are much more principle-based, and I think we've gotten ourselves in a place that we understand what's needed here. We do have some tweaks that we suggested 22E. I know we're booked for time, so we will send these through to you, Julie, they're not major ones, but they are trying to just to hone down the some of the places where I think some crisp wording might be better. I think I have one more thing to change page. Sorry. And just that we like the reinsertion of 22G. So thanks. Great.
Thank you, Rich. Josephine.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry to come back. It was just something that Len brought up in his comments that I just wanted to respond to in 22G. And Len had made the point that firms in certain circumstances may set their own objectives, which is right. And we've suggested that is the case. And we've required firms to think about that. But then Len, in response to that, says that in 22G, and Len, forgive me if I haven't quite got this right, that therefore we may have to modify those objectives. And in the last meeting, or when we last talked about this, I raised the point that we can't say here that they might modify objectives because we have set objectives in these standards that are mandatory and are required in all situations. And so we can't suggest that firms would modify those objectives. So perhaps if I could just say to Julie and the task force, just be very, very careful if you do change this to make sure that we don't inadvertently allow the situation where the quality objectives we set in this standard are removed or modified. Thank you.
Tom, can I just
Please do.
respond to that? And Josephine, you hit the nail right on the head, because I'm reflecting on a conversation even a while back more about this discussion about modifying the quality objectives. So we've been very aware of the fact that we don't want to imply that that could be the case. What we do want to get across is that there could be a need for additional quality objectives. And Len, I think maybe part of your comment, I think, was that there could be a time where you add additional quality objectives, and there could be a time when those are no longer needed. And that could be perfectly acceptable because the situation has changed, but the quality objectives in the standard themselves shouldn't be modified. And so we just want to make sure I don't think we could go down that road as a task force, because I think that would definitely change previous discussions and decisions on that point.
I see Len coming back in. So Len, I think that you're coming in on this topic, right?
Yeah, that's right. Julie and Josephine, you're right. I'm not saying we should, there's a certain quality objective in the standards that has to be there. But some of the ones that firm actually develop themselves, in addition, some of the granular objectives, but because the practice has changed, business has changed, maybe there should be the opportunity to whether to alter them or modify them, or may no longer applicable. So I'm looking at that set of the objectives, not the ones that's required in the standard.
Okay. Yosh?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the jury and task force, and thank you very much, of course, for Chair Tom. I have just one comment. I almost supporting the definition revision of definition, but as mentioned by Len, the terms likelihood and magnitude are also terms used in the audit risk-based approach. So I think such terms are useful to understand the concept of the thresholds of quality risk, and the risk map is a general analysis tool in all over the world. So if the task force does not use such terms or risk map, the differences from the risk-based approach should be explained in the background of the conclusion, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Karen?
Yes, I just wanted to ask this change for, I'll just say the definition. There were some comments from monitoring group members, and I wondered if the task force had had discussions with them on this proposal and their views. Thank you.
I'll let Julie address that as she goes through the comments. But clearly that the task force's hard work was appealing to the board, because I think the thrust of the comments are broadly supportive of question one and two. But Julie, can I turn it back to you? Any reactions to things you heard, including Karen's question?
Sure. So I jotted down a couple of things to come back on, and we talked about the quality objectives one already. I think, Len, we could probably deal with the firm added quality objectives, if I can label them like that, in an application material paragraph that says, it's like, if the time comes by which you don't need that additional quality objective anymore, it can be removed. We can get the words right, but I think we could probably deal with it that way. I guess we have talked previously about those sub bullets in 22E and removing them and making that 22E requirement paragraph simpler. I think we got clear direction from the board when we talked about that before to keep it the way it was, and the task force has a strong view to keep it that way. So we hadn't proposed that we would move those bullets out. We think that because the firm's risk assessment process is new, and that we think those are key factors for, I shouldn't use the word factors, we changed it. The long term for factors, we think those are important, so we wanted to keep that in the requirement. So that was the task force view on that point. And then I understand the preference to have likelihood and magnitude in the standard somewhere, but it has caused quite a bit of confusion along the way in that quality risk definition. So I'm somewhat hesitant to bring those concepts back in when we've tried to keep the definition now back to something that's more principles based, and we've tied it to the threshold of reasonable possibility. And so we thought as a task force that met sort of all the feedback that we'd heard over the time on that definition. So the last point before I get to Karen's question is, in A24F, despite the fact that that example's been there for quite a long time on the scalability point, we have heard in a couple of places that, you know, performing the firm's risk assessment as a whole, maybe those words are a bit misleading as to what we were meaning by that. Really what we were meaning is that, and I'm contrasting it with a large firm example. In a large firm example, you would have a whole lot of people involved. You would farm out the different components. People would do risk assessment by component. They would do risk assessment for the other areas. You would kind of get back together and bring it all back together, and it would be a much more, let's say, disaggregated process than an aggregation at the end. We thought that in a small firm that could be very well be done by one person, and they would work through the different quality objectives and likely by component, because that would make the most sense. But we didn't want to dictate it had to be by component, but we could probably come up with a few different words there so that we're not implying, you do one procedure at one time, tick, you're done the firm's risk assessment process, because that's not what we were intending. So I think we can probably easily fix that up. Natalie, I'm going to ask you if we've had any interaction with the quality risk definition on just to respond back to Karen's question.
Yeah, sure. So we have had a couple of outreach interactions with monitoring group members. In the last 6 months or so, we've had some discussions with IOSCO and presented feedback to them on the overall comments that we got on the EV. And we've also recently had some conversations with FER. I can't say that we've specifically gone into the details of the quality risk definition or the firm's risk assessment process. Particularly more recent discussions with FER were more focused on the implementation dates. But I think that there is, and I'll probably hand over to Billy in a second, I think that as we head into the finalization of the standards, that there will be probably further engagement with the monitoring group members. Billy, I don't know if you have any more to add.
Thank you, Natalie. I think you're quite right. We have done our regular outreach to them. We haven't spoken to them specifically about the quality risk definition. But Karen, I think we've, during the course of this ISQM 1 project specifically, we had a number of occasions where we just went back and cross-checked against the comments that were received. I know the PIOB has also published that separate analysis of the comments that were received. And we can certainly do that. I think we can certainly do that in Q3 just to make sure. I think we are comfortable that the changes that have been made is responsive to the comments received, but there's no harm in just doing that reconciliation back. So that's something we can focus on in Q3. Then Tom, maybe just while I have the floor, just additional perspective to Josh's comment about the likelihood and magnitude. As Julie has indicated, it has caused a lot of confusion, and the other reason why I think the task force has also decided to rather remove it is, remember, other than what we have, for example, in ISA 315, in QM1, we do not require the risk assessment to be a formal scoring or rating system. We do not require that distinct consideration as we have in the 315. So if we bring the likelihood or magnitude back, it will defeat the purpose of that flexibility. Nothing would prevent a firm from introducing a system where they specifically look at likelihood and magnitude, but we want to rather keep that flexibility as it is stated in A24Q. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up on these first two questions. My sense is no one's raising fatal flaws as it relates to these 2 points, but we're conscious of the comments that we've received.
Yep. That would be my summary too, Tom. And I mean, there are a couple things from an examples perspective or application material paragraphs that we'll definitely reflect on, but I didn't hear any fatal flaws, at least on from what I heard. So, okay. Moving along, another picture. So our issues paper was full of pictures this time. This was a depiction that we added in our paper that ties to the next topic we want to cover, which is the definitions of deficiency findings and some of the changes we made to monitoring and remediation. And the reason why we added this picture in the issues paper was because as a task force, we started to think about comments that we had heard on both of the definitions of findings and deficiencies. And we thought that this picture really clearly laid out why those definitions need to be crisp, and then what the actual outcome is from those definitions. So you'll know that in the findings definition, that plays a really important point to when you move down to paragraph 47 in the standard, which is when you need to start evaluating those findings to determine whether deficiencies exist. And so when we started to think about comments we had received and feedback we'd received on the definition, we wanted to think about it as to what outcome in the standard is required as a result of that categorization of information or issues that you come across. And then secondly, as you move down to the next level, you have deficiencies, and that also plays a really important role because the deficiencies drive an evaluation, they drive a root cause analysis, and they drive an effect on the overall system of quality management and ultimately your evaluation. And so we also wanted to depict this sort of in a way that showed the flow and why the findings definition and deficiencies definition, as we outlaid them, really drive future requirements in the standard. The little green box there is just to reflect the fact that when you're collecting these information sources through your monitoring activities or external inspections or other sources, because you'll come across a lot of information, there could be things other than things that are by definition findings. And that information is really useful, and the information is really useful in a lot of different aspects of the system of quality management. In particular, it could give you information to inform your root cause analysis. It could give you information from an information and communication standpoint. And so we wanted to reflect in that green box with the little bubbles, the fact that that information, while not classified as a finding, does make its way into the different components of the system of quality management and is not forgotten. And so that was the intention of the diagram. So that moves us actually into the next section where we have some questions. The definition, particularly the definition of deficiencies, the definition of findings, and as I mentioned, the changes to the monitoring and remediation section. And the definitions of deficiencies fit into that bucket that I referred to in my opening comments around going around to the different solutions and coming back to something that is very closely aligned to what was in the exposure draft. And that was what we took away from the previous board discussion on this topic. So we've gone back to something that closely resembles that definition, keeping in mind that we had to modify it slightly because the standards moves from the exposure draft. And so some of the concepts have changed around. And so we had to make sure we reflected those changes in the definition. So that you would have seen that in the redrafting. The definition of findings hasn't substantially changed. In fact, it's only changed for a small editorial change because we thought through that definition of findings, and that's why we put the picture in the issues paper to try to dictate how you need to have that filtering process of the findings in order to get to the next stage, which is in paragraph 47 around the evaluation. And then monitoring and remediation has been a bit of a hot topic. And so we've updated the draft to reflect the board comments in June. And we also got a fair number of offline comments by the task force that we've updated to reflect in the new drafting. So I'm just going to open it up then, Tom. We have 3 questions here. They're somewhat related. So if people feel free to respond to all 3, I'm happy to take them all at once.
Yes, and also just pay attention. You can see on the screens the specific paragraphs that are being referenced in the agenda papers.
Sorry, I should have called that out.
Yeah. So we're talking in the definitions 19A, 19GA, A9A, A10, A11A, and A11B, 42 to 53, and A154 to A186. Fiona.
Thanks, Julie. Question 3, supportive of the definition of deficiency and the related application material you've got there. Question 4, supportive of that definition as well. Question 5, supportive, just some editorials which we'll provide offline on A156 and A161B, but otherwise very supportive. Thank you.
Sorry, Josephine.
Thanks, Julie. On question 3, I'm very supportive. Thank you. I thought the table in paragraph 18 actually might be useful later for implementation guidance. I thought it was a very good layout of the thought and the logic. And the next question, I did understand the flow chart, but I still don't think the last piece of that findings definition is quite right. So findings to me are a matter of fact. So all information from all sources when you're performing these assessments is findings. And we don't have a requirement to follow up on positive findings, only to evaluate those from those sources to determine if there are deficiencies there at all. So I'm not sure why I understand why findings have to be confined to only those that indicate that one or more deficiencies exist. I personally find it really confusing, and it feels like there's a piece missing. And I know the application material tries to explain it, but I just don't think you need that other threshold in findings. So I prefer that last piece to actually be deleted. And in terms of monitoring on the whole, I'm happy with what you've done. Like Fiona, I've got a few editorials, and I'll send those on. You don't need those right here now. But clearly on 44 big A little c, I did actually miss something at the meeting, and I don't really support this change. And I'll explain why. The risk assessment and monitoring process to me is critical to continuous improvement. And that means in respect of both the risk management piece and the monitoring M&R and the M&R piece. Both of those need to be fit for purpose. So you need to assess the adequacy of both those processes. And I can't really accept the argument that the monitoring over the risk assessment process in and of itself, and I'm taking this to an extreme, you don't actually say that, but in and of itself will actually tell you how adequate your monitoring and remediation process is. I do think you need monitoring of the monitoring. I understand it's a ridiculous phrase and it's difficult to get our heads around, but I'm just very concerned that we're implying that in some cases you don't even need to monitor the monitoring process, and that to me is a flaw in that particular argument. So I would like the task force to have another think about that, please. Thank you. But yes, as I say, all the rest very supportive. Thanks again for all the hard work.
Thanks, Josephine. Isabel?
Yes. So on question 3, supportive of the definition. On question 4, supportive of the definition, but we look back at the picture. And in fact, when we look at the picture, first of all, we find it very complex. Normally, I'm a big fan of pictures, but in that case, the picture is complex and there is a lot of words in this picture, so it makes it maybe more complex. But we are really are not understanding why the definition of finding in the picture is different from the definition of finding in the standard. In the picture, the definition of finding says which may indicate that one or more deficiency exists, while in the standard, it is written which indicates that one or more deficiency may exist. So it's a different wording, and so I don't know which one is right and if it's equivalent or not, I'm not sure. Then regarding question 5, I'm supportive. Just one question regarding paragraph 44. In paragraph 44, the monitoring activities are performed as a basis for the identification of deficiencies, which is of course the ultimate goal. But we did this exercise of trying to define first the findings, and then among the findings, which one are the deficiencies. So shouldn't we have somewhere in 44 or in the application material to 44 the concept of finding, which is a kind of middle ground before you reach the deficiency level? Thank you.
Thank you. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. First to question 3, I'm generally in favor. I have some minor comments which I will send offline. Referring to question 4, I'm in favor too. No comments, also no minor comments. And referring to question 5, I also very in favor and have some minor comments which I will send also offline. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Kai. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Again, I think these questions address some concerns that I've raised before. Supportive on all. I support the definition of deficiencies. I like what you've done on findings, and I actually like the diagram, and I like bringing out the positive outcomes that's dealt with that issue. So a little bit inconsistent, I think, with Josephine. I thought that was a positive view. Also support the changes in the monitoring and remediation section. Again, a concern there had been the proportionality, and I think that you've addressed that with specific paragraphs in the application material. So thank you for that.
I would be remiss not to say that Imran, you don't see him on the call right now, mainly because they have a black power outage where he is in South Africa right now. I think weather related, but he said he would send his comments offline after this meeting. So he sends his apologies, but it is because of issues well beyond his control. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. Julie, I'll just work through the questions one by one. On question 3, are supportive of the definition of deficiency, and on question 4, also supportive of both the definition and the application material. In question 5, support the revisions that you've made throughout there. Just a couple of comments, and I think this might be the same comment that Isabel made, but just the linkage between paragraph 44 and 47, where we sort of there's an interim step from identifying the deficiencies and evaluating the findings. There's something there about there seems to be a need for application material around taking the gathering the findings and then evaluating them. So maybe it may help to add some application material there just to create that linkage. On A161B, we struggled in a couple of places there. I'm just trying to flip down to the paragraph. In the scalability example, it refers to in a complex firm leadership, in a less complex firm, leadership's daily interaction may provide sufficient information. And maybe this is Josephine's point, I'm not sure. We thought that seemed a bit light in terms of obligation, because it doesn't really explain what a daily interaction might be and how that would be strong enough to monitor the monitoring activities. There was also in A61B, the change that was made to the introductory wording we found a bit complex and actually preferred the original wording there, perhaps with some amendments, but those are just our comments on the application material. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Kai Morgan? Oh, wait, hold 1 second. I'm going to ask Julie to come in here. There's been a lot of comments right now, and so maybe it's a good place to allow Julie to respond to some of what she's heard, and then give a little bit of an intermission here.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'm not going to respond in question 3 because I heard okay from a lot of people, so I think that's amazing. Check. Yay. We don't have to go back to the buffet of choices that we were running out of options for. I'm going to put findings just to the side for a second because Natalie's going to jump in on that one. But a couple of the comments we heard on the monitoring remediation changes, and so Josephine, the change we made to 44A little c, I believe is consistent with how we explained the monitoring and remediation and monitoring the monitoring in the explanatory memo. However, appreciate that things have moved from the explanatory memo to where we are today. Is your concern, because I'm just trying to flesh out the concern so that we can properly address it. So is your concern that you need to monitor the monitoring or remediation in a way that you would, actually, it becomes very circular and you pull a string and you never end monitoring the monitoring? Or is your concern that the design of the monitoring and remediation process needs to be, I'll call it monitored for lack of a better word, and that the design needs to be just like you would look at the design of the firm's risk assessment process, the design of the monitoring and remediation process would also need to be considered? Because I see those maybe as 2 different things. So I just wanted to maybe, Tom, if it's okay, get that clarification, because I think that the answer to it could be quite different depending on, Josephine, where you were headed with your thoughts.
It's the latter. So we have to at some point, firms have to at some point make an assessment of the design of the monitoring remediation process. And I don't think you can get that just through looking at what you get from the monitoring of the risk assessment process. And I think it was A16B, the middle bit, which made me worry that we were implying that you wouldn't ever monitor. You could be in a position where you wouldn't ever need to monitor the design of monitoring process. And that was what worried me about the change that we made. It's the point that says, including to the extent to which the firm may need to specifically monitor. So that's how I'm interpreting it. I'm interpreting it as a get out of what I think is still a critical part of your monitoring activities.
But reflecting on the scalability point, that could look different, could look quite different in a large firm versus a small firm, right? Because understanding the design and ensuring it was, adequate and appropriately designed could be quite a bit less formal activity in a small firm than it would be in a complex firm.
Yes, and I absolutely accept that. And maybe it's the way it was described in the issues paper, the words that we don't want to infer, you always have to look at it. Whereas maybe what you were trying to describe, or maybe I didn't understand it properly, but perhaps what you're saying is the extent, the nature, time and extent of the monitoring work you do over the monitoring process will vary depending on the type of the firm, its characteristics and so forth.
Okay. Yeah, I think the task force was reflecting on some comments we had gotten the last time around on monitoring, and that feeling very circular, and this sort of layer on of monitoring on top of something you're already doing from an activity perspective. So that's why I wanted to ask you the question, because I felt like those were two different scenarios. But Tom, if we could get any reactions to that from others, that would be really helpful, because that would mean we would need to update that, probably update a couple places in that section of the standard to reflect that change.
Okay, there are hands up for the round, but if you have a comment related to this specific point in reaction to the exchange, please raise your hand physically right now and I'll call on you, because I don't want to lose the order of those who are queued up. Any reactions to what Julie and Josephine were describing? Lana, you just raised your hand again. I don't know whether it's on this topic or just the end of the queue.
Yeah, it's on this topic. I was going to say I support Josephine's comments, but I had a call with the staff perhaps a couple of weeks ago. I think what got me over the hump is the examples. I think Julie inserted a more complex firm examples, and 161B. I think that kind of helped me. I don't know whether it's helping Josephine, but I do support Josephine's comment, but I didn't want to raise a comment specific to that point because I thought that the example you added in 161B was helpful. So that was my conclusion. Thank you.
Anyone else want to come in on this topic? I guess my only concern is, Julie, do you have, Rich, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was only waiting because I know I'm probably next up or the one after that. So I was just going to do everything together, but.
Just on this specific point.
Yeah, I know.
I'll get you in. You're coming up on the other top.
But so I like the change to A44AC. I probably was one of the ones I'm monitoring the monitoring process concern. I personally think A61B, including the examples, makes it understandable what's being asked here. So I like the changes that were made, and actually would start to have a problem if we move back and try to address this a different way.
Josephine?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Len, and Rich. The examples are helpful. The words that worry me are just in the application material. I can live with the change to the requirement where it says including the extent to which the firm may need to specifically, and that to me gives you a get out, and it gives you a get out of the design as well. So if that middle piece of the sentence could be tweaked so it didn't imply that at no point at some point you could decide you don't have to monitor the design, because I don't think that's what we're saying. if that could be tweaked, I'd be happy. Happier, sorry.
Julie?
Okay, I'm gonna, before I agree, Natalie, do you have any thoughts on whether that's gonna throw a huge wrench? Because I think where we were intending to say is that the design of both the firm's risk assessment process and the design of the monitoring and remediation process are important for both of those processes. So but we do understand there'll be a lot of ways in which that'll get done. But Natalie, do you want to jump in here in case I've reflected something?
No, I mean, I think to Josephine's point, maybe we could have a look at those words in the middle there in A161B. I'm hearing support for the examples, although Eric, I think you had some suggestions that maybe that needed to be tweaked. So I think we could look at these words and just see if we can do something just to help clarify it. And just, I think the point here is we were trying to bring home the scalability point in terms of what firms need to do. So I think that's just getting across that is important to retain. So I think it should be okay for us to maybe make some changes here, just to get that more clear.
Natalie, while you're on, do you want to just address the findings comment? Because that was another one. I wondered if we were going to get over the hump there.
Yeah, sure. So I think what we reflected on when we heard some of the feedback from the March and April discussions was that when we look back at the comment letters we got from the ED, there was quite a lot of comments that came back around what we describe as the framework for working through findings and getting through to deficiencies. And there was a lot of comments around us needing to clarify that. So obviously through the process of responding to those comments, that's when we've obviously introduced this definition of findings. When we look back at the ED in terms of how we describe findings, which was an application material, I think it was broader and did include kind of all information. But in order for us to try and clarify this framework and be responsive to the comments, the task force felt that it was helpful to have a definition that is a little bit more clearer around what the scope of those findings is. If we lose that last part in the definition, it opens up that definition of findings to include quite a broad range of information. And then when that works its way into the requirements, which sits all the way down in paragraph 47, it makes it quite a broad set of information that you would be thinking about when you're applying paragraph 47. So this was really the thinking of the task force and what we'd worked through and why we concluded that we didn't drop those words in the definition, that we would still keep it contained to information that may indicate that a deficiency exists. But I think, Tom, it would maybe be helpful if we could get a few more views also on this one from the board in terms of whether we drop those words in the definition. So it's paragraph, sorry, let me find my way here, paragraph 19. You think I would know off by heart? I do sometimes. It's paragraph 19GA, whether we drop those last few words, which indicates that one or more deficiencies may exist. I think that's what Josephine was suggesting. So it would just be helpful if we have some more thoughts on that.
Okay, I think we want to make sure we closed off the issue, the exchange with Josephine, and I didn't see any reaction when it was suggested that you could do some drafting on those words in the application material. Ray, like by some gesture rather than the digital hand, if you need to say something on this point, let me know right now. But I assume that there's no objection to the task force working on some language as it relates to that application material. I don't see any violent objections. So people seem generally good with the approach taken by the task force, but with the caveat on those words. Secondly, I think we now need to go to what Natalie said. And I don't know if people who are commenting, I see Kai, Rich, and Bob. I don't know if you have comments on 19GA right now. Let's pause for a second to get comments on that, and then you will get an opportunity to say your full comments on this section. Any people want to comment on 19GA? Seems like no one. So I think, Natalie, I take that as sign of support for the task force's approach. Were you hoping to have some opposition? No.
Just clarity on what we
Yes. Okay. So we explicitly considered it, and you see that the board is supportive right now. Okay. Now the ever patient Kai, Rich, and Bob will get to you. Kai, fire away.
Thank you. Supportive on all three questions. Similar to Roger, I also liked the diagram in the issues paper, so would like to see that kept somewhere. That's it.
Great. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. So a couple comments. So on deficiency, happy with what's changed. It was really something that came out by finalizing on quality risk. And that's what is meant by properly assessed in paragraph 19A II. You know, if quality risk is an outcome of an understanding of the conditions and events, and then assessing whether such events and conditions affect the achievement of the quality objective, the question is, you don't necessarily first identify and then assess. So our question is really does properly assess mean the extent that the risk has not been assessed correctly, i.e. that the risk is higher? And if so, we wonder whether application material might help to explain that. The other part I wanted to come in on, and I think it'll probably not be a surprise to you, Julie, is on the monitoring remediation. So I think I've raised this in every session, and I'm going to go out swinging again. And that is the point about having completed in the lead into paragraph 45, as well as in 45C, I think it is. You know, having it and saying that it is part of code reviews or part of a quality management system is troubling, in that there's nothing we can do once that file's done. The file's closed, audit report's gone. You're not managing anything at that stage. And so, to me, the monitoring program should be a wider one. And we've said this all the way through. It should be both ongoing as well as completed reviews. And so I think by limiting the requirement to only completed, by putting it in the lead-in as well as 45C, which I agree with, that the tests that we have to do, the 1 in 3 or 1 in 5, whatever we want to go to, is the right place. But I think we should be leaving it open that monitoring could be both. And I know application material tries to go there, but that's not the same if the requirement says you must do completed. So I know I keep bringing this up, and I partially keep getting shot down. But then, so the other part, I didn't quite understand the issues paper in paragraph 23, where it seemed to say that all the work that's being done on COVID-19 on hot reviews and pre-report issuances and all that somehow explains or makes the decision to go to complete the right decision. And I'm not sure the two of those are related. I think if anything, it shows that the ongoing open file reviews are really necessary, and it's great that you can do that, and that's what firms have done during this difficult time right now. With respect to the language in the application material on 3 to 5 years, we have some minor changes that might help make it a little easier to make sure that those aren't in fact de facto requirements, and so we'll pass those along. The last point I have is just you deleted 1A155A And I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's right not to be where it's at, but I think it's a valid comment, and I think that we should try to find a place in the application material to keep it. Thank you, Tom and Julie.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Seems a bit anticlimactic now, but we do support the change made for the definition of deficiency, particularly as it relates to moving some.
Bob, would you mind? I can hardly hear you. Actually, in fact, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
It's not great.
No, it's not.
Hold the.
Okay, let me try something. I'll come back, Tom.
That's better. We could hear
Okay.
you.
Wait, that's
Wow, I never had the. Okay, with respect to question 3, supportive of the change, particularly moving the sub-bullets, some of the sub-bullets into the application material. Also okay with question 4 on what we did with findings. Question 5, similar to, I think, Roger, and some that have been mentioned, I think the examples that were added relative to scalability and how that would work were very helpful. So also support what's been done with monitoring and remediation. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, that's all the hands that I see up on this round. Julia, I guess you received a lot of support in this second go around with Rich's comments. I don't know if you want to respond to some of Rich's points.
Yeah, and probably an apology to Kai to make him wait all that time to say he was okay with the questions. But so Rich, I mean, we have talked about that completed engagement piece of the requirement before, and really what we were trying to get at there was not to discount the fact there could be lots of other monitoring activities, but that was to set out the requirement specifically for completed engagement, inspection of completed engagement. So that's why it's in there. And we haven't heard other board feedback to the contrary. So we've maintained that position all along. The comment in the issues paper was really just to reflect on the fact that, and this wasn't to tie COVID-19 response to completed engagement inspections. It was just to say that there's a lot of things going on and firms are doing a lot of different things. And so we've just, observed that as a result of firms having to react. It was more tied to the fact that there needs to be some flexibility in that cycle, potentially in times when things are in flux. And so that was really the intention of adding that into the issues paper. So if it came across wrong, apologies. So, Tom, I think that was it. That was all I wanted to address. Yeah. That's all right.
Okay. I think you feel as if you have broad support again on these questions with the points that you addressed, particularly the Josephine interchange that we had on that language of the application material. So I think we could keep on moving on.
Okay.
We'll probably, I'd just like to take a break in about 15 minutes. The question is it, would we rather do it now for 10? Or do you think we could get through the next question? I think the next question is a single question.
Let's try to do the next question.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Okay. Evaluation. So we had made the evaluation was really what we were trying to reflect on as a task force were comments that we were asked to clarify the difference between those different conclusions. You'll remember back a couple of meetings ago, we had added in a third conclusion. So you had your reasonable assurance conclusion, you had your non-reasonable assurance conclusion, and then we had added a one in the middle, which was like an except for. It was still reasonable assurance, but reasonable assurance except for. And you think what we were asked to do, if I recall properly, was to go back and further explain the except for conclusion and to provide some application material and some examples as to what might be a circumstance where you were severe but not pervasive and would lead you to that except for conclusion. So that's what we've done there in paragraphs. Really, those are the changes in that section, paragraphs 65A to 65D and the associated application material. So Tom, we're just asking the board for their thoughts on those changes.
Josephine.
Thanks, Julie. Really supportive of this. Tiny weeny editorials. I just have a comment, maybe a question about A209A. In particular, where it says it may not be possible or practical. So I scratch my head on this one, because this person has been assigned ultimate responsibility and accountability. And I certainly understand practicalities. You can't go out, depending on the size of the firm, you can't go out and gather all this information. You might need people to assist you in certain areas, but a possibility could suggest that the person at no point can actually make this decision, and I don't know that that's quite the right message we want to send. So I just thought maybe I understood what we meant by possibility, but perhaps if you can have a think about maybe deleting that, or let me understand, or try and help me understand why we have that there. Thank you. But really support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Kaiwe?
Thanks, Tom. I'm generally in favor. I have one comment referring to paragraph A, 209A. It seems to be a requirement missing for the firm to take responsibility for the evaluation of the system of quality management and to assign the performance of the evaluation of those individuals. This is my only comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Kai. Fiona?
Thanks, Julie. I'm supportive of what you've done here. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Len?
Thank you, Julie. It's same comments in A209A. I think the first sentence you talk about the firms responsible for the evaluation. Then firms also has responsibility to assign people to do the evaluation. I think that's fine, but the ending sentence you said, the individuals are responsible for the system of quality management and the requirement in the standards. So the first part is about evaluation, doing evaluation. Then the end sentence is about responsible for the whole system and the requirements. So it's still not clear to me the connection between the two, the evaluation part and the people who's actually the firm or the individual responsible for the entire system. So maybe some clarification on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Fernando?
Thanks, Julie. Also very supportive on the changes. I just picked here one item that I want to discuss with you, and it's in paragraph 65C, little b, and then 1, which includes the word individuals. And this requirement talks about when there's a qualification in the system of quality management, there's a need to communicate that to engagement team and individuals. And also paragraph 53 talks about communication of deficiency, severity, pervasiveness, and remedial actions to individuals. And if I go back to the revised definition of individuals that you have now, it pretty much talks about people from the firm, which is fine. Then people from the engagement team, which is fine, from the networks. But then it also includes others outside the networks, say, service providers, external experts. And it seems that this requirement is implying that communication about those topics needs to go outside the firm, which probably was not the intended purpose of the definition of individuals, but because it was included here and we didn't change these requirements during this last revision, I think there's an issue here with those words here. I would really see firms struggling, saying that they need to communicate such items to others outside their firm or network. And I'm not really sure if it is a simple fix, just removing the word individuals, or if there's a need to include something to also include other people that needs to be aware of these two items.
Thanks, Fernando. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. I like where we've got to, especially if you take it from a standard setting perspective. I think in practice, it's going to be difficult for firms to work out where the line is between pervasive and what's not pervasive. But I'm not sure there's anything we can do about that. I think that's just something that, we got the principles right, and the firms are going to have to work that out in implementation. So I'm happy where we're at.
Thanks, Rich. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Generally supportive. Stumbling over a little bit on the word individual, like Fernando. Struggle with, the way that individuals is now defined. So people outside the firm, service providers, taking ultimate responsibility seems like an unusual situation, or having the ability to undertake ultimate responsibility. That would have felt probably better in the practitioner definition, but there might be a reason why, but it is going past me if there is a reason why. And we've discussed this before, but I can't remember the justification. Apologies.
Thanks. Ty Morton?
Thank you. General support, but like Landru, I also think that A209A is a bit confusing on the responsibilities, and people may struggle to see who has the responsibilities in the situations.
Okay. Anyone else like to raise any comments on this? If you don't, I'm taking it as you're supportive of the requirements and application material, with the exception of the comments that have been said. Julie, it comes back to this question of the individual point, and also the application material A209A. So I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. And Natalie's going to refresh my memory on, Roger, your question, because I know we talked about it. We had a call about it and we talked about it. So I'll ask her to chime in there. The change in the definition to individuals, we really haven't scrutinized and flowed through the entire standard yet. That was something we did, and actually it's coming up in one of our questions today on those definitions that we've added in now to paragraph 13B. So I guess it was great to hear it raised, because we want to make sure we catch all of the places. But I think we, as a task force, and Natalie as staff, we need to go through and make sure we've scrubbed through the standard. And if we get agreement on those definitions, that we've got it reflected properly everywhere. So I would maybe just ask for a little bit of time to go through that, pending the ultimate decision on those definitions, because we really haven't flowed it through the standard yet. So, but that will be one we will look at for sure. I think we don't want to complicate things in A209A. So if we've complicated it, we'll take a look at it. The paragraph that this links to is paragraph 22, which we didn't provide you in this draft because we were conscious of only providing you the sections in relation to our questions. But hopefully that helps part of it. But I'll have to say, remains to be seen when you see paragraph 22. But if we've complicated things in paragraph 209A, we can take a look at that wording. But the idea there was to, the concern from the task force perspective was that, yes, an individual has ultimate responsibility for the system of quality management, but they're assigned that responsibility by the firm, and the firm, it is not all on one individual person as their person. It's on their role within the firm and being assigned that role. So that's the message we were trying to get across in that application material paragraph. Natalie, the individuals that could be assigned some of these responsibilities that might live outside of the firm, can you just refresh my memory on how we got there as a task force?
I think, so when we thought about this, because this is something we crossed our minds, and you know, we were thinking of scenarios, particularly within networks where there's, for example, regional networks, and there may be a person that's in charge of a regional network that, strictly speaking, if you're looking at the definition of firm, may be considered external to the firm, but actually that person is actually the person that is assigned responsibility for the system. They're not actually, they're external to the firm when you're looking at the definition of the firm, but in terms of their roles and responsibilities and the context of the firm, they could then be considered an individual because of how the definitions are set up. But this is also something, as Julie mentioned, we've got to take a look at paragraph 22 and 22A, where we deal with that assignment of responsibilities, and that is something we're talking about as a task force in terms of how we can just make it clear. Because to Roger's point, I think we acknowledge that we can't have it completely outsourced in assigning that responsibility, and we just need to make sure that's clear.
Thank you. Any other comments? Julie, can I suggest we're making good progress here, and I'm glad that people are supportive of the general direction of the task force. It certainly gives us more confidence that we're headed in the right direction. And we have a few more topics to cover, but I think it would be a good time, if you don't disagree, to take a short break now. It's 5:27 p.m. my time here. I say 5:28 now. I say we get back at 5:40, so 12-minute break. I just want to get have the time to run through everything. Thanks for a good session, great presentation so far, and we'll return in 12 minutes.
Hi, Bob. Do you want to do a quick test with your mic?
Yeah, Ron, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. It's still a little soft, though.
Is it really?
Yeah.
This is really frustrating. I do 100 of these a day the same way. So let me try something else. Just hang on.
Okay.
How is it now?
It's actually the same.
It's better, actually?
No, it's the same as when you had the mic on. So I don't know if this is something.
Okay,
it literally sounds exactly the same.
When you hold the little white microphone you've got on, Bob, close to your mouth, it's excellent. But for some reason, when it's hanging down, it's very hard to hear you, which is surprising because you've got a really good voice for calls like this.
I was going to say, it really is amazing to me because it's like all of you. I probably do 20 of these calls a day, and this is the first time. Last night was the first time I had this issue, but it's okay as long as I hold it close like this.
Yeah,
yes, fabulous. That's fabulous.
Okay, that's what I'll do. I just wanted to make sure with the session coming tomorrow morning that you could hear me. So.
That's a good
point. This evening, not so much, but tomorrow morning, it's rather important.
Yeah, it's important.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.
Okay, no problem, Bob.
Okay, we're going to get going in about a minute. Okay, Julie, are we ready?
I'm ready.
Fire away.
Okay. Relevant ethical requirements. So the reason why we're bringing this one back, and it's really paragraph 32 where we made the adjustments as a task force, was that in our previous discussions, the task force had tried to what we thought was a simplification of the quality objective, which was to combine different groups of I'll call them people. So firm personnel, others, into one quality objective to really try to simplify and have less words in the quality objectives. But in doing so, we may have complicated it. And I think one of the unintended consequences of what we tried to do was we excluded a group in doing that. And so the task force went away. We thought about how to fix that issue. And we really came to two options. And the two options, as a task force, we were okay with either option. So we really couldn't put our finger on one option versus the other option. So we thought what would make sense is to bring both options back to the board and have you weigh in on which of those options you prefer. Because as a task force, we were quite comfortable with either one. The first one being something back to what the quality objective looked like before, which separated out the populations of firm and personnel, and it's separate from others. And then the second option is the more of a combined version with it all together. And so what we're looking for from you from a feedback perspective is, well, one, comments, and two, if you prefer option A or option one or option two here, so that we can nail this one down. The other paragraphs referenced in the blue box on the slide, which is 41 big A, 2 little a, and 41 big A, little b, while they relate to that requirement, they weren't touched by the task force as a result of this revision. But for completeness, we have them in the draft. So Tom, I'm looking for commentary on question 7.
Question 7. In your comments, please give clear guidance if you believe option 1 or 2 are viable, which option you prefer. Ultimately, we'll probably, if there's not a consensus form, and we'll have to take a straw poll too. But Josephine?
Thank you, Julie. I'm very supportive of what you've done here, and my preference is option 1.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Josephine. Fiona?
Thank you. I don't have a strong preference either way. I'll go with the majority of the board.
And sort of that implies support in general for the approach, Fiona?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Lynn?
I support the approach. I have a slight preference for option 2, but my reference group preferred option 1. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. Julie, I prefer option 2. Thanks.
Okay. Kai? Morton?
I also prefer option 2.
We lost you. Was that 2?
Yes, it was 2.
There's a little bit of intrigue going on there. It's cut out, just as you said, I prefer option. Roger?
Agree with the approach. Not a strong opinion, but a preference for option 1.
Len?
Like Fiona, I can live with both approach, both options. I'm supportive approach, can live with either one.
Thank you. Rich?
So maybe opposite of what Lynn was, I think the reference group was more in the middle or maybe two, but I'm in option one. So I have a preference. I could probably live with two if that's where it was ending up. I think that's where I think in our comments, back in March, we said option one. The other part I had on this though, Julie, was the words that are in 32B at the end of the B, and that's we're bringing it, or we have the network firms, personnel, network firms, or service providers who are subject to relevant ethical requirements. That the network isn't subject to the IFAC code, and so I'm not sure that this construction works. We did pass this by our IAASB technical advisor, and he had the same perspective. So I do wonder whether this wording works and whether we should be talking to the IAASB on whether you can put that wording like that. Thanks. That was it for this section.
Bob, Dor?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And both me personally and our outreach group are okay with the approach and had a preference for option one. Thanks.
Okay. Isabel?
Preference is option one, but on the other hand, we thought it was very complex. Now, for example, the component auditor falls under the category of others, which is not intuitive. And then you see that the component auditor is in the same bucket as service provider that may provide services that are totally different nature. And we have already defined in the definitions in 13B, the personnel, the individuals, and the engagement team. And now we add this other category of others. So it makes it overall very complex when you try to understand who is where and what does apply to this category. And additional small question on this option B, option one, small b, when we say we are subject to the relevant ethical requirement to which the firm is subject, do we mean to the same relevant ethical requirement than the one to which the firm is subject? If it is what we mean, maybe we should have the same, because it would help for translation. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Eric?
Hi, Tom, thanks. I have a slight preference for option one, but support either. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, what I've learned from this discussion is that it won't be a fatal flaw for anyone if you choose one or two. I basically hear a slight preference for one right now. So with that, unless you're unspoken, the silent majority isn't speaking up for two, I think you get a slight preference for one right now. And my understanding just is that this would not be a fatal flaw. If you feel like you're in the silent majority and need to be part of the spoken majority for two, please raise your hand now. Okay, I think, Julie, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. That was my tally. I think I had a few more in the option one category than two, but so that's really helpful. Rich, maybe just to address your point on the inclusion of the network, I do think that the network can provide resources. And if if so, like for instance, using an expert of the network, they would be subject to the relevant ethical requirements. So that's just one example of how that might apply in there. So I don't know if that's a fatal flaw for you, but maybe you want to just let me know if it is, because we didn't hear that from others. So
can I just maybe
yeah,
also
and Natalie's going to help save me and help explain it better than I just did.
No, not at all. I just wanted to reiterate that we had coordinated with ethics leading up to the June meeting. We had sent them the poster draft, and they just sent one small comment back on some application material, but there was nothing substantial on the requirements. So we have coordinated with them on this wording.
And I'm forgetting we did that. Yeah, you're right.
Thanks. Rich, do you want to come back in on this point?
I probably do need to sit back and think about it, but I can't believe it would be fatal, but I just need to think about it. It doesn't seem to be the biggest thing in my mind, but I also didn't think it would be the only one that would say it. I hear what you're saying, Julie, but I don't necessarily still get that from the words. But again, let me think about it, and we'll come back if it's a bigger issue than just a comment.
Okay.
Josephine?
Yeah, Julia, I'm very supportive, and option 1 or option 2, as Tom says, no fatal flaw. On Rich's point, you might just want to pop back to IAASB and ask them specifically, though, unless, of course, Natalie, they already confirmed it, that if an individual is working within the system of quality management, because engagement teams are covered. So if it's someone from the network, you know, that place in the sky, if it's someone from there and they're working on an engagement team, then they are captured. But if they're working on the system of quality management and there are, for example, ethical requirements that would apply to them, are they captured? So I do think it might be worth just double checking that. Thank you.
Okay. Just looking around, I think we could proceed.
Okay. I think the next slide has an example on it. It might be. So before I get the animation going on the next 2 slides, because once you see the example, you may be focusing on that as opposed to just a bit of a lead in as to this topic. So what we were finding was that when we were trying to draft the standard and we were talking about all the people that play roles, whether it's within the system of quality management or it's within the performance of engagements, we were getting a little tripped up about how they get dealt with, particularly in the resources component. And it came to light really when we started talking about component auditors, and how, if your component auditor is part of a network or your component auditor is part of your firm, but they're not part of your firm, it got very jumbled up in this discussion. And so what we did, and this was a significant coordination point with the other task forces. So ISA 600, the task force, ISA 220, and to a lesser degree ISQM 2. But this was really a coordination point where we had to step back and say, fundamentally, for those that are involved either in engagements or the system of quality management, does the firm have any responsibilities associated with those folks? Or is there something that's left only to the engagement team level to deal with? And what we got to the conclusion was, we think that the firm within its system of quality management has responsibility, although it varies based on the circumstances. But we didn't want to exclude any of these folks from the ISQM 1 standard, because there is some responsibility that the firm needs to deal with. And those 2 areas are fundamentally the making sure that there is access to the appropriate resources and that are appropriate, and that the competence and capabilities of those resources for whatever role they're playing are evaluated. And so we came to those 2 points. So then we stepped back and said, okay, well, they all play a role somewhere within this. How do we make that work within ISQM 1? And so what we've done is we basically included everyone within ISQM 1, but tried to provide some application material. And I'm going to walk through a couple of examples where the firm's policies and procedures could be quite different based on where those resources are coming from. So the policies and procedures are going to be very different for a firm that hires someone versus a component auditor that's engaged by, let's say, from a statutory perspective, somewhere else, and you're using them. The engagement level responsibilities sort of remain the same. The engagement level responsibilities would be evaluating the competence capabilities with some sort of escalation process available to engagement teams should they not be the appropriate people. So we thought it might be helpful because it was quite a long piece of the issues paper to give a couple of examples of what we were getting at with the content in the issues paper. So Armand, if you can click through, this is a first example. We had two different ones just to sort of show this. So the first example, and we're talking in a group audit here, so we're talking about the situation where you have component auditors. So firm A, so my firm is appointed as the group auditor. My firm, being firm A, assigns those individuals to the group engagement team. Then firm B comes into play because firm A determines that there's a component, and that component has a statutory requirement to have an audit, and they've gone and engaged an auditor in their jurisdiction, and so they're going to be a component auditor in my group audit. So I now have firm B. Firm B would assign the resources to that component audit team because they're the ones that are engaging with, like that firm is responsible for that audit, but so firm B assigns those resources. That said, firm A still has some responsibilities to determine that the use of firm B is appropriate for use in the performance of the audit procedures for that component, because remember, the firm A is the one engaged to do the group audit. And so we started to think about what those responsibilities would look like. They're likely things like that would be executed through the firm's risk management process or other policy manuals where, let's say on acceptance and continuance, you would evaluate who your component auditors are and make sure they're appropriate for use. Do you know anything about them? How much of your group audits being audited by component auditors, those sorts of things. So firm A still has some responsibility despite the fact that firm B is over assigning the resources to the component team. Then the group engagement team follows those policies and processes and confirms that firm A is appropriate for use. And then the last point is really when it gets down to determining the competence and capabilities of the individuals on that component audit team. And those are largely done at the engagement level because the team needs to make sure that the resources that are provided to them through the component audit team are appropriate, they're competent and capable. If they were to determine that they weren't, there would likely be firm policies and procedures to be able to address that. So that might mean things like talking to the component audit firm, maybe adding more resources at the group level, those sorts of things. So that was one example that we talked about to try to illustrate the point. If I move on to the next example, we're still in the group audit example. We still have firm A, and we still have the group engagement team resources assigned by firm A. In this case, we don't have a component audit team out there in the jurisdiction where we need work done. So firm A needs to go out and engage with a component auditor in order to get that work done. So firm A would have work to do to make sure that that component auditor that they're engaging with is appropriate and fills the need to perform the work at the component. That said, even in that situation, firm B would still assign individuals to that component audit team. And then firm A would be determined that, as I said, they would determine the use that it's, they would determine if it's appropriate to use firm B, and that would sort of come through their selection process, how they go engage in a component auditor, do they have a list of known firms, that sort of thing. And then again, just like in the first example, at the engagement level, you have the requirement for the competence and capabilities to be assessed. And that largely comes through firms' methodologies on how they would apply, let's say, ISO 220 or ISO 600, because those requirements are in those two standards and they operate at the engagement level with the appropriate policies and procedures to escalate if necessary. So we just wanted to give those two examples because when we started to think about, we got tripped up on the words, who assigns who and who belongs to who and what the responsibilities are. The component auditor one was one that we thought we could give an example to show that there could be differences, but ultimately firm A in this situation, which is the firm that's operating their system of quality management, does have some responsibilities for those component auditors, despite the fact that they're not part of their firm and they're not being assigned by firm A. So hopefully that was clear. That's what we were trying to get across with these two examples. So then if we move to the next slide, we're really looking for some feedback on paragraph 13B and a related application material paragraph there, because you've noted a couple of times already in your feedback that's new, and that is a new piece of content we've added. And then we've adjusted paragraph 38 to try to reflect the fact that despite the fact where these resources come from, there are still quality objectives that would apply, and that the firm's policies and procedures in some circumstances would need to be different based on where the resources are provided from. So, so Tom, that's the background to the question. Question 9 has two parts to it, and we're really looking for feedback from the board as to one, is there agreement that all of these resources, despite the fact of where they come from, play some role in the firm's ISQM1 process? And then secondly, I guess, comment on the content itself.
Thank you for laying that out. I'll invite board comment on question 9 now. Josephine.
Thank you, Julie. Fantastic explanation. Totally understand it, and very supportive of A and B, and supportive of the direction that you're taking here. I think it's a very robust way to deal with a situation which is complicated and not actually dealt with in our standards today. Just a couple of things we are going to need to think through in relation to service providers, and particularly in relation to the way that we've dealt with them. So I might get a bit tongue twisted here, so bear with me. So when we're dealing with component auditors who are not in the network, so take the network firms out of the situation, those component auditors are going to be dealt with under this ISQM1 as a service provider. So we had, when we went through the engagement team definition with IAASB on 220 and on 600, we specifically separated those two out. So service provider stands alone, and it's a contract that the firm has with the service provider. So if we're thinking if that service provider is providing a methodology, for example, and then the non-network component auditor is also a separate piece, and IAASB are now obviously dealing with the project to look into this further and see what needs to be done in the ethical standards to address that. So we had agreed that with them so that they could go down their path and address those issues. That we recognise some of those exist today, but they still need to address them. And also we have some of that language that we have in 220 also in our exposure draft in ISO 600. Now, I'm not trying to raise problems here. I think it's just a conversation, because they may not be concerned about how ISQM1 deals with the policies and procedures in relation to non-network component auditors. Here comes the tongue twisters. But it might be very confusing to practitioners. So on this contract point, so the definition of a service provider in ISQM1 reflects what was initially discussed, so that methodology idea and having that contract. But a network or any component auditor, 99% of the time does not have a contract. And as we know with the group audit team, it's more of an agreement through the various communications. And even if you were to say that the component auditor is contracted by the component management, via the group management, that doesn't really work. It's not a direct link to the firm. So I think that whilst it's not explicit, it's implicit in that service provider definition now that we're including those non-network component auditors. And I think what we could do is just do something else in the standard that says, for the purpose of this ISQM1, non-network component auditors are dealt with as service providers, and leave it out of an explicit definition. Because part of my concern about getting that engaged by the firm confused is because we moved away from that when we changed the definition to 20, because that engagement word, engaged by the firm phrase, was actually causing so much confusion. Who's in, who's out? Now, I know that my suggestion here isn't ideal and we need to think more about it, but if you could have a think about those two things, that would be great. Thank you. And then on some of the application material in A120, A120B, A120C, some of that I think actually belongs in the network piece, network requirements, a very minor thing. And then some of them, I think the way it's described is probably too high level. So I have some suggestions and some editorials on those that I thought I could just send along with you, to you. But ultimately, I am really supportive, subject to us really ironing out that IAASB and the service provider definition point. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Great examples which outline the issue and the problem. I suppose a couple of comments in this area in general. The first is paragraph 13b, which is where you are outlining terms used. I'm comfortable about that being in the introduction section. They sound like they're definitions, and it sounds like we're sort of de facto definitions, and they've actually been referred to in this call as de facto definitions. So now within the introduction, we've got a terms used component. That's a new concept as far as I'm aware. And so the distinguishing between that and definitions, and then using such things as defining things like individuals. So I understand the concern, but that there. The other issue for me is, I think you outlined the issue, and what I would push for, and I don't know if there is a solution, is the harder situation, which is probably the box, your example box A120E. What do you do when you're using an external firm or a service provider? You know, how do you get the information? How do you make sure you get that information? So I don't know why they would provide you details as to the quality of the individuals. You know, I've given you my best, or I've given you my worst people to work on this particular job. If you can do something, and I don't know what that is, if you can do something in that hardest scenario, that would be useful to include in that box. So that's where my comments are. I understand there may not be a solution to that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Roger. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. So this human resources area is probably the area that I have the most issues with. It's to some degree it's similar to what Josephine was talking about, although my suggestion would go the other way than she said on the service providers. But you know, like I said, to me, I think we're getting this over engineered. We sort of know what we want to get to, but we're getting stuck in the definitions and the words, and we're trying to then fit things into each of them and think, well, it fits, so now it works. And my problem is I don't think it works. I think it's going to confuse a lot of people. It's confused me. It's confused the people I do outreach with. You know, the delineation between what's in and what's outside the firm, I'm not sure that really is helpful. You know, if we're talking about component auditors, then, you know, to me, I think we should let that be in 600 and let them deal with the appropriate competence and capabilities there, i.e. how to apply 220 when we get there, and trying to bring it all the way back into the definitions in ISQM 1. I'm not sure that helps. Like I said, the other resources from the network or service provider, the firm's policy procedures may set out the basis which those are appropriate to use. You know, I guess that works, but I do think we just need to find a way to simplify this. To, you know, I think we're getting the terms and definitions, which, like I said, work, but I just really don't think they're understandable when we actually try to put them in practice. I do have some examples, which I'll get to in a second. But if we, when we look at the fact that component auditors are part of the definition of an engagement team, then trying to look and say, well, you might be a service provider if you're another firm, if you're within the firm, but not my firm, but network firm or different. All those things, like I said, are subtleties, which I just don't think we need to get so complicated. When we get to 220, I actually have a similar issue when we get there, so I'll raise it there. Julie, you talked about already about the personnel, individuals, and engagement teams, and I know you said you or the task force needs to go through and look to see does it work for each one, and I fully support that. I have not done that, and when I look at an example might be if we're looking at a STC that if I'm in the UK and I'm using the UK STC, those personnel are staff, but the STC in another network firm, so within the firm, both of which are part of the engagement team, are individuals. I'm starting to go, well, why are one staff, one individual? They're both on the engagement team. They're both part of the firm. Again, can I get there? Yes, because the way the definition, I just don't think that complication is needed. So, and again, this is obviously we're happy to see if there's something we can do to try to help. So, we'll give some thought if you want us to think that way. Thanks, Julie. Sorry about throwing this on you.
Fiona?
Thank you. I just wanted to go on the public record and explain my support for what you've done as a task force and apologise for background noise. For the rest of you, it's the end of the day. It's the beginning of day here and there's demolition and construction work happening outside my window. So I apologise for any noise that comes through for the rest of the call.
Thanks, Fiona. Kaiwe?
Thanks, Tom. I have two comments to paragraph 13b, and there to the paragraph with the term individuals. There's a second bullet point, and there refers my comment. My comment is by not applying the who perform procedures for the firm on an engagement or activities with the system of quality management to personnel. The term personnel would include administrative staff, which I believe is not the intention. I therefore suggest moving the noted phrase so that it applies to both personnel and other natural persons. And my second comment is to the term engagement teams, is the third bullet point. My question is, does this mean that the quality management requirements at firm level also apply to external experts and internal auditors providing direct assistance? If so, this definition may not be appropriate as written. Please consider whether this is the case. So this has been my two comments. Thanks.
Okay, one last one, and then even if there are others, I'll pause for Julie to react. Kai Morton.
Thank you. My comment is a bit similar to Rich's. I think that, yes, the requirements application material in this area may get you there, but I'm wondering if there is an easier way of doing it and that we might be overcomplicating a bit. And you can also see that by the amount of application material that's been added lately, this becomes very complex. And if we need that amount of application material, to me, it indicates that we may are trying to overcomplicate it.
Okay. Julie?
Well, I guess we're looking for solutions at this point if there's fatal flaws with this, because we've sort of gone around and around. You'll remember a previous draft where we had service providers excluding component auditors, which didn't work. We had component auditors here and there, and then we put them all over the place. And so I do think with all the different parties that are involved, we felt we needed to include them all, and this was our solution to including them all. Any other alternative didn't fit, because the two other alternatives we considered, just for context, was one, we leave component auditors out and it's all dealt with at the engagement team level, but that didn't feel right. And it also felt really strange to deal with component auditors in that sense and not the other individuals the same way. So we didn't want to leave, and I think fundamentally from a public interest perspective, we didn't want to leave the firm off the hook to have responsibilities for making sure that the engagement teams have the right resources. That looks different based on who the resources are, but at the end of the day, the firm has that responsibility because they're the ones that are being engaged to do the audit or the engagement. So that's where we got to on the halfway. And then you can understand our thoughts on the no one in, because that just took us one step even further, which was if no one's in and it's all left to the engagement teams, we didn't feel that was appropriate either. So those were the three options we came up with. I'm really happy if someone has a fourth option, open to hearing it, but that's how we ended up with where we are. So I don't know if there's more examples we can provide, like, outside of the standard, to give some ideas, like the couple of examples I walked through. That's certainly probably, well, I should say it's possible, but we're sort of at this stage where we need to have a solution.
Billy wants to come in. Billy?
Thank you, Tom. I think I just want to give a little bit of context. I think the first thing, before we get stuck on the wording as such, is that in the issues paper, the task force is clearly setting out that the firm is responsible for ensuring that the engagement team has access to the appropriate resources, and the engagement partner is responsible for ensuring that there is a sufficient appropriate resources to do the engagement. And how that is managed is through the policies or procedures of the firm. So we can't have a situation where the firm does not have any influence over this. And this is done through the policies and procedures. And that is how it's set out. I think what we need to have very clear in principle agreement on, at least, is that by moving to the service provider definition as it is now, where actually nothing is carved out, are we comfortable that is conceptually a purer or cleaner approach? Because really what we're saying now is we're simply left with the fact that whoever works in terms of the engagement or in terms of the system of quality management can either be in the firm or in the network or outside. And so the task force felt that is actually being simplified now. Yes, we need to have some application material to just get that point across, and especially the point that it is driven by policies or procedures. But I think we need to make sure that we are comfortable with the principles of the firm always has a responsibility to make sure there's access to appropriate resources. The engagement team will follow the firm's policies and procedures to make sure they've got sufficient appropriate resources for that engagement. And we're really just dealing with three categories. You're in the firm, or you're in the network, or you're outside. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Billy. Julie, you have anything to add to that? I think that's the core concept that we have to see if there's enough agreement around. And then I think the issue of appropriate drafting and application material is another issue, some of which we will not clearly resolve today, other than there's a concern about the complexity around it and a desire to simplify. But could we get some reaction, like maybe by Lynn, you were about to jump in?
Yes, I would like to. Thank you, Julie, and I have been involved in this, so I do support the concepts that underlie it. I just wanted to share some of the concerns of our reference group because I think it might be helpful. They said that it was good to have a new quality objective in this area, and they conceptually agreed with it. It was the practicalities that they were concerned about. For example, confirming resources in other networks, components, etc., isn't easy. Scalability, and given the amount of application material, it looked like too much process. And then how do you document it? So I suspect the answer here is not in the concepts, but in streamlining the application material to get those key points very clear for people. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Just some reactions, I guess, and sharing some thoughts here. The first thing I would say is, obviously, we have some really talented people on the task forces that have looked at this long and hard and have come to where we are. So in large respect, Julie, I appreciate some of the frustration around, what else is there we can do. I think my reaction is that the way Billy explained it in simple terms and the examples, the slides that we worked through and everything seems very understandable. But then when we get to the application material, there is a kind of visceral reaction that it must be much more complex, and I'm not sure it is. So Tom and Julie, I think where I'm at is I support fundamentally and conceptually what we're trying to do, but Tom, I agree with you that this is something, obviously, maybe look at some drafting and some simplification, but something we can't get to, obviously, on a call today. But I do support fundamentally where we've ended up here. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Rich?
Yeah, very similar to Lynn and Bob in that conceptually I agree, and I think Lily did a good job at trying to bring it back to what the principle was and what we're trying to get to. And I can get there. Sounds easy, but I think it's once we get into the words, especially the definitions that go between firms and in and outside the engagement, not engagement team, but in and outside the firm, starts to make it more complicated. And like Bob and Kai, I think getting the application material down to an understandable point, because I think it's practical is the problem. Is this practical to do it this way? And right now I'm worried about the practicality, not the concept. I think the firm's responsible setting the policies, the engagement team follows those. Okay, thanks.
Okay, Roger?
No problems at all with the concept, Julie, as outlined by Willie. The quality management system should always make sure that, as far as possible, that you've got the appropriate resources to bring to the engagements in those particular areas, and you should monitor and look at those. Again, it's the practicality as outlined there, but no problems at all with the concept.
Okay, we've heard very similar reactions. No other hands are up. So my guess is, as articulated by Billy and by the task force, is that the concept people in principle support, right? So the question is can we articulate the practice via the application material in such a way that makes people more comfortable that it isn't a more complex concept than it really is. I guess to me, we won't resolve the drafting question. Indeed, that is sort of what we've intended the next couple of months to do anyway, in terms of this may just be a more intense area of drafting for the task force. But Julie, does that seem about right to you?
Yep, I feel better now. I'm starting to.
Okay, we're not tearing the fundamentals up at all. It's,
I was like, oh dear, option 4. I don't have option 4. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay. Good, really robust conversation there. Glad that was aired out. Really, thank you for coming in to provide clarity there as well. Should we move on?
Yeah, and I actually think when we move on, that's moving on to Lynn. So I'm going to hand it over to Lynn.
Rich, you were about to come in?
Yeah, did I know it's late for me and I'm getting old, but did we go through question 8?
The communications, we're coming to that. That is at the end because you know that there was a supplement paper to the board on communication. So
okay,
that's its own topic. So yes, you're very observant. We did not change the whole numbering system of this world overnight. We will get back to lucky 8 at some point.
That's good.
You're on mute, Lynn.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Julie. Julie said at the beginning of her presentation, I was going to pop in. Well, I'm now popping in. And if we can move to the next slide, please. And in this session, before I start, I'd like to thank almost everybody because this particular issue, as Julie has so well already set out, has been one of the major issues between ISQM 1 to 220 and 600 over the last quarter, and a significant number of board members. So I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for getting us to where we are. And what we are going to do, and the reason why we are popping into the session, is the tight connection between what Julie has already said in ISQM 1 on the human resource objective and the discussion and what we're proposing in 220. So in this session, I intend to pick up where we left off in terms of what we propose in 220. Then we will have the discussion on that before I update you on what else has happened in terms of 220 and the next steps. So moving on to the next slide. And I was going to explain conceptually what underlay this, but between Julie and Billy, they have done that brilliantly. So if you keep that thought in your head, and also I need to apologise, I think I said at the last meeting that we would look at paragraph 25, but we're unlikely to change the requirements. We've changed our mind on that. And that's because this is the one issue we found with 220, that there were a variety of board members that had the same issue. And in simple terms, the concern was that not all of the human resources for an engagement are provided by the firm. Let me give you an example. In a component audit that is a statutory audit, the company may appoint the auditor themselves, and they're also used on the group engagement. that means that they are not actually assigning the resources by the firm. And however, it's also important that the firm is involved. One of the initial objectives of 220 was to make sure that the responsibilities of the firm were clear. So given that that was the problem definition given to us, we decided in paragraph 25 to delete the words that were causing people concern, so the 3 words by the firm were deleted, and to include the point, and I think Billy made it very well, about firms' conceptual responsibility. We added the words, the firm's policies and procedures. The example that I gave has been included in the application material, and we've also made some slight changes to A60. So that's what we've done in terms of paragraph 25 and associated application material. Paragraph 27, which at least a couple of board members had the same issue, we have tried to align that, and this is caught up in the issue between personnel and individuals. So we've changed the word to personnel, from personnel to individuals, and done some slight updating of the application material. The other minor changes are for alignment with the 2 ISQMs and to simplify some of the wording. All of that material is in paper 5C, and if we can now move to the question. We are very interested, in light of what you've heard about ISQM 1 and ISA 220, on whether you support these changes, and if you don't, why not, and do you have any suggestions? So thank you, Tom. Back to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for that explanation. Any comments? Sachiko.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Lynn, for your explanation. I support overall I support the direction, but I only have a small comment on paragraph A73A. And the paragraph A73A states that the engagement partner may discuss the matter with component management when there are insufficient or inappropriate resources in relation to work being performed at the component by a component auditor to make sufficient and appropriate resource available. But as this is an issue relating to resources at the component auditor and not at the component itself, it is not clear to me for what purpose the engagement partner discuss with component management to make sufficient appropriate resource available. And if the group engagement partner discuss the matter with component auditor and the matter has not resolved, I think it is usual that the group engagement partner discuss the matter with group management rather than component management. So my suggestion is changing component management to group management, or clarifying the purpose of such discussion with component management. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachiko. Chun-Li?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Lean. A very early morning greetings from Singapore. My first comment is exactly the same as Sachiko, so I want to support that. Secondly, I have 2 slight editorial comments which I'll send through, one of which relates to A60A. I mean, the last sentence we talk about policies and procedures that may require engagement partner to take different actions. I thought that sounds a little bit cryptic. I'm not sure whether people looking at it know exactly what we're trying to say. And not everyone had the benefit of listening to conversations that we've had. I think essentially what we're saying is, you know, in regardless of where you get the resource from, engagement partners are required to determine that component auditors have the appropriate competence and capabilities, etc. And the firm's policy and procedures may address such a scenario where resources are not directly assigned by the firm. And so it's a little bit back to the presentation that there's a slide that Julie presented earlier. So I just wonder if we can just make it a little bit clearer to people and have some suggested wording that I'll send through. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Fiona?
Thank you, and thanks, Lynn, and well done for having to collaborate with everyone in virtual time zones and in virtual meetings. Very supportive of the changes that you've made in this section. I have a couple of really minor editorials, which I'll give to you and Brett offline, but thank you.
So Julie, it's your turn to comment,
Oh,
not to receive.
different seat now. Lynn, I'm very supportive of what you've done. We provided you with 2 or 3 minor things offline. And one of them was actually the same point Sachiko raised on about component management, but we didn't see that as, we didn't think any of our comments were really fatal. So overall support.
Thank you, Julie. Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Great job. Just wanted to let you know our outreach group, as well as myself, are very supportive of the changes made. Like Sachiko, we stumbled over the component management thing in A73A also, but weren't terribly bothered by it because it's you may do something in an application paragraph, but it does beg the question why you would talk to them in that circumstance. So other than that, very supportive. Thanks.
Thanks. Sue?
Hi, yes, thanks. Just to say supportive of the changes proposed. Thank you.
Thanks. So Rich?
Thanks, and thanks, Lynn, for the changes and work that you and the task force did, but also for having the call with us, which was very much appreciated during the board meetings. So I guess the first comment, just to close the loop, the issue about personnel and individuals that we talked about in ISQM 1 obviously comes in here. And again, I wonder if we're getting a bit over analyzed on trying to get down to the detail there. Plus, just to make sure that they all work is the second point. Regarding the deletion of the word firm, I think that's the right answer. The addition of the reference to the firm's policy and procedures, I think you can read the requirement as is without that, and I think it works fine. I think the principle is there. So I'm not sure just adding the firm's policy and procedures is really needed. Additionally, when we talked in March and April, my comments was talking about the principle, because one of the big issues was how do you practically get someone to be able to get the knowledge on a shall determine basis. Sorry, I got flies here. And the wording that was in paragraph 9 was referred to us, and we do think that's very helpful. But we do think that trying to build that out a bit in the application material would make it much more easier to understand on how this might work on a more complex and large assignment. I know we suggested some changes, but we don't have that part of the text to tell whether those are made. We're happy to continue to share suggested wording if you'd like us to. And then on A73A, pretty similar to the comments that others have made. I think the problem is the context there is a bit missing, because I could actually get to why you might go to the component. They have the client has the contract with the auditor, But I agree with Sajiko that the most logical one is you go to the group, because that's who you have the relationship with. But I think, again, maybe it's just fleshing out why we're making those comments there. The one I also had a problem was just the firm itself. I know we're trying to draw everything back to the firm, but it would probably be the last people I go to between the other names we have in there. So thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Rich. Fernando?
Lynn, also in favor of the changes, and I don't have any concern with the component management in paragraph A73A. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. Lynn, do you want me to pause here? We have 3 more commenters, or would you like to hear the rest before I turn it back to you?
Complete it.
Okay. Eric?
Thank you, Tom. Very supportive of where we've ended up here. Had the same comment as Rich on paragraph 25. I'm not sure that the additional words are needed. On A60, I agree with Chun-Wee on the last sentence. We were kind of left hanging about what that meant. And on A73A, we can live with the component management being left in. We realize the circumstances where that might be appropriate. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Roger?
Supportive of the changes, Lynn. I actually don't mind the words in there. I think it just shows the coordination back to ISQM1, and that's obviously continuous and difficult as each part moves. So well done on that particular regard. I agree with Richard. It would be good to have some application material as to how this might work in a complex audit. So if we can do something there, and we've got a couple of editorials which will feed through. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaiui?
Yeah, also support from my side to the changes. Thanks, that's all.
Okay, great. Lynn, I turn it back to you.
Thank you all very much for that support. That's very heartening. What I hear is that we need to have a look at A73A, although there's a bit of differences of opinion there. We need to look at A60A, and I hear you, Eric and Rich, on firms' policies and procedures, but I do think it's important that we have that in the requirement. So if you have a very strong opinion, it would be useful to hear that. And I look forward to all of the, and application material on the practicalities. We'll also look at that and look forward to your edits coming through. So thank you very much for that. I see Lynn's come back.
Len?
Yeah, I just want to reflect on paragraph A73A. That actually was there to be consistent with the ISA 600 ED. There was some language in ISA 600 ED talk about engagement resources, and component management was one of the party identified to communicate. So yeah, I listened to the comments and I work with Lynn, but that language came from ISA 600. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing that out, Len.
Yeah, and just to explain that a little further, given that often the component management have appointed the auditor, if you're going to make any changes to that, you need to talk to the component management. But it sounds to me like we either have to do some referencing or some explaining around it. So we will do that.
Any further reactions to Lynn's summing up? I think she, in my mind, barely reflected the discussion.
Okay, shall I move on to the next slide,
Yes,
Tom?
yes, please.
Okay. Hold on. I seem to have frozen. I'll be back with you in just 1 second. Sorry about this. Everything's frozen at my end.
Then we can hear you fine.
We could hear you, and the next slide did appear about your action since the March board meeting.
Okay, in that case, I'm now back, so I can think. So the first thing, and I've already thanked the board members that talked to us after the March and April meeting, and the two issues were raised by them. One was in terms of proportionality between 220 and ISQM 1, and a concern that the engagement partner was asked to review where in 220, whereas the ISQM 2 requirement was to objectively evaluate significant judgments. The task force believe that the review is the right word because the engagement partner is actually making the judgments, and the EQR is then evaluating those significant judgments, which is in line with the very long definition we've got in ISQM 2. However, given one of the board members has got concerns of this area, we think that it will be important to include this in the explanatory memorandum at the beginning of the standard, and also consider it an implementation material. So whether we make it an FAQ or something else, not sure at this time, but that's how we've resolved that particular issue. The second issue that was raised was around whether basically upward scalability again, in paragraphs 24, 26, 30 and 41, which is if a member of the team collates information or provides information to the engagement partner, the issue raised, is that an administrative task, or is it something that should be some thought and some analysis applied to it? We were meaning the latter, so the intention is to once again deal with this as an FAQ. So that's the first thing we did between the board while we were looking at the human resource issues. The second thing was obviously the ongoing coordination on all the issues, and I would like to compliment both the staff and the chairs for the incredibly productive way that's been done, because it has taken a lot of time, energy, and really clever thinking. And finally, we have been working with IAASB in terms of the biases and in terms of the engagement team definition to make sure that their work on role and mindset and on independence requirements are all in line. On the biases, I think we have got agreement. We had one outstanding concern as to why we omitted two of the biases that IAASB are using. We've explained that we don't think they are as relevant to an assurance project, and so that I think that particular part is very close to being agreed. Brett's more up to date with the engagement team definition work, which has been happening recently with staff. So I'd just like to give him the opportunity to update us on that. Thanks, Brett.
Sure, thanks, Lynn. So on the engagement team definition, the Ethics Board received a presentation last week looking at their initial thinking on how they deal with it. It is turning out a little different to how we thought it might have gone. As they're trying to grapple with how to incorporate non-network component auditors into the code as it's currently structured, they are just exploring a few different avenues, including basically having two definitions, one that's tied to audits and one that's tied to assurance engagement teams. So it's the rationale for why they do that is really buried in the code. And, you know, if anyone's interested, feel free to reach out to me. But there is some subtlety there about why they're going down that route. I guess the main message for the board is that we'll stay very close to them as they work through this to make sure there are no unintended consequences or mishaps between the two processes, and we'll involve the task forces as much as we need to in order to get there. At the moment, they're still at, you know, we haven't seen words on a page yet, so it's still at the conceptual phase. So once we start getting words on the page, we'll know more about how to tackle it. But the message is very much that we will be collaborating very closely with IAASB as we need to through these next couple of months. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brett. And the final slide, what we'll be doing from now on in is this quarter is planned for us to do our coordination between the four chairs and obviously the staff, making sure everything is aligned. We have a schedule of things that need to be aligned. I have to say there are no major conceptual issues at this point in time. We've just talked about ISPA. That will be an ongoing piece of work, and we will stay very close to ISPA as they progress their work. We are also going to start work on the implementation plan. I know there's some discussion on that later in the week, but exactly how that will look at present isn't entirely clear, but we would certainly appreciate any feedback or any input from board members if they have any clever or strong ideas in this area. And finally, if we feel that we need to do any outreach around application material and what would be needed for that, we could well do that, but that will be as required. So that's it from me, Tom. Thank you everybody for your attention and for your very useful input and comments.
Thank you, Lynn. So one minor clarification. You said explanatory memoranda. We know that you meant basis for conclusions is where that material will go. So I just wanted to make sure that people didn't probably understood what you meant, but if people were confused, I just wanted to clarify that point.
Thank you very much for correcting me there. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. It's I think it was probably understood, but for the record, I felt like we should clarify it. Okay, I'm not, Julia, I know the slide says external communication. I don't think we have time for this important public interest topic tonight. And I know there's, based upon Rich's question, so much enthusiasm to have this conversation, but clearly this is a big public interest topic. We've talked about it a lot. In fact, I think this task force was definitely very responsive to some of the push that we had at the last meeting, not to have pure voluntary element to our standard in terms of external communication. And this really is an effort to address the repeated public interest issue. The paper, I believe it's 5D, right? I just recommend people to pay clear attention. Where we're likely to address this topic is on Friday morning, where we believe we will have time to gain. on it and on our agenda. We still believe the 3 hours will be sufficient in the event that there is time tomorrow to do it, but I don't want to take anything away from audit evidence. That's a really important project. So audit evidence will have 3 hours tomorrow. We likely will get to this on Friday. Clearly a very important topic. I think what we're doing, what's being proposed by the task force is very responsive to the public interest issue that has been raised with us. So with that, I think we should close right now. It's 5 minutes early. I think Julie and Lynn and the task force you've got a clear support on much of the direction that you have. So I do believe that, with the exception, particularly on the human resources question, like where we need to focus on application material, basically we've closed the major issues off in the views of the great majority of our board members on this topic. So I don't know if you want to have any closing words before I ask Karen or Jim whether they have anything to add.
No, Tom, I've been taking notes. I think we have a few things to tidy up. Definitely that last point that we talked about, we'll take another look at the application material, but we got a very good steer and direction on all of the issues we were hoping for. So really happy as a result.
Okay. Jim, anything from the CAG perspective you'd like to raise as we take the session?
I really don't have anything in addition. I was looking at the notes from our CAG meeting, and I believe the task force has addressed, some of the subjects, a number of the subjects brought up. So I don't think there's anything in addition at this point I want to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen, I know there's great anticipation for the external communications topic. So sorry to make you wait a couple of days, but anything on what you've heard today from a public interest standpoint?
No, I look forward to Friday's discussion, and I think we've had a very robust meeting covering all the issues to a successful conclusion, I guess, for the task force. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, well, Bob, we have a big day tomorrow. We're going to decide on audit evidence and the path forward on that. So I'll let you rest up and prepare for that discussion. And I wish everyone else a good evening or good sleep, or in the case of some of our people who are already in Thursday, have a great day. And Chudway, I will excuse you if you want to nap later today for having woken up so early this morning. So thank you for doing that. So good night.
All right.
Thanks. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.